The summer heat beat down on the cobblestone courtyard outside Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists crowded behind the iron gates, cameras raised and voices chattering in dozens of languages. Among the sea of visitors stood James Rodriguez, a 32-year-old investment banker from New York City, who had arrived in London with his girlfriend Sarah and a group of friends for what was supposed to be a relaxing vacation. James was the kind of person who commanded attention wherever he went. Accustomed to being the center of his social circle with his expensive suits, confident demeanor, and sharp sense of humor that sometimes crossed the line into mockery, standing perfectly still in his iconic red tunic and bearskin hat was Guard Daniel Morrison, a 26-year-old member of the Coldstream Guards, who had served in Afghanistan before earning his position at the palace. Daniel had been standing at his post for nearly 40 minutes, his face expressionless and his posture impeccable despite the sweat trickling down his back beneath the heavy wool uniform. He had learned long ago to tune out the constant noise of tourists, the flash of cameras, and the occasional attempts by visitors to make him break his stoic composure. James noticed the guard and saw an opportunity for entertainment. His friends had been taking the usual tourist photos all morning, and he wanted to create something more memorable, something that would get likes and shares on social media when he posted it later. He handed his phone to Sarah and approached the guard with an exaggerated swagger, already planning the poses and gestures that would make his friends laugh. What started as a few silly faces quickly escalated into something more disrespectful. James began mimicking the guard's rigid posture in an exaggerated manner, goose-stepping around him while his friends laughed and encouraged him. Other tourists started gathering, some smiling uncomfortably, while others began recording on their own phones. James was feeding off the attention, his performance becoming bolder with each passing moment. Daniel remained completely still, his training taking over as he focused on a fixed point ahead and controlled his breathing. He had dealt with disrespectful tourists before, but something about this man's behavior felt particularly aggressive and intentional. The mockery wasn't just playful teasing. It carried an edge of contempt that suggested the tourists saw him not as a professional soldier, but as a prop for entertainment. James moved closer, now just inches from the guard's face, making monkey noises and waving his arms. Several tourists in the crowd began to look uncomfortable, sensing that the situation was crossing a line from harmless fun into genuine disrespect. A few parents pulled their children away, not wanting them to witness or learn from such behavior. But James was too caught up in his performance to notice the changing atmosphere. Sarah tugged at James's sleeve, suggesting they move on to other attractions, but he brushed her off with a dismissive gesture. He was enjoying the attention too much to stop now. He pulled out his phone and started taking selfies with the guard, positioning himself to make it look like he was mocking the soldier's serious expression. His friends continued laughing, though some of their laughter now sounded forced and uncertain. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion. Among the onlookers was a group of British military veterans who had come to the palace for a memorial ceremony. They watched James's display with growing anger, their faces hardening as they saw one of their own being treated with such disrespect. One of them, a gray-haired former sergeant named William Patterson, began making his way through the crowd toward the scene. Daniel's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only sign of his internal struggle to maintain composure. He had faced enemy fire in combat zones, protected his fellow soldiers under the most dangerous circumstances, and earned multiple commendations for his service. Standing here being mocked by a wealthy tourist, who clearly had no understanding of sacrifice or duty, felt like a different kind of battle, one where his training required him to simply endure rather than respond. James decided to take his performance to the next level. He began shouting at the guard, asking ridiculous questions and making jokes about the uniform. He reached out as if to touch the guard's rifle, a serious breach of protocol that could trigger a swift response. Several tourists gasped, and security personnel stationed nearby began moving toward the scene, their body language shifting from casual observation to alert attention. It was at that moment that everything changed. A young boy, no more than 7 years old, broke away from his mother's hand and ran toward James. The child had been watching the scene with growing distress, confused by why the man was being mean to the soldier. In his innocent understanding of right and wrong, he felt compelled to act. The boy positioned himself between James and the guard, his small body trembling but his voice clear as he told James to stop being rude. The unexpected intervention by the child created a sudden silence in the crowd. James froze, his hand still extended toward the guard's rifle, his expression caught between amusement and surprise. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment as she realized how far her boyfriend had taken the joke. The veterans in the crowd moved closer, their protective instincts activated by both the disrespect to the guard and the child's brave intervention. Daniel's eyes flickered down to the boy for just a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible break in his rigid stance that spoke volumes about his awareness of the situation. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but a child defending his honor while he remained frozen by protocol was not something covered in any manual. The boy's mother rushed forward to retrieve her son, apologizing profusely to everyone around them, but the damage to James's performance was done. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had started as entertainment for some had been reframed by a child's moral clarity as exactly what it was: bullying and disrespect towards someone who couldn't respond. James lowered his hands slowly, suddenly aware of dozens of eyes judging him. The laughter of his friends had stopped completely. Sarah had turned away, unable to watch anymore. The veterans were now standing in a loose semicircle around the scene, their presence a silent but unmistakable statement of solidarity with the guard. Palace security officers arrived, their expressions professional but firm. They began clearing the immediate area around the guard, politely but insistently moving tourists back behind the designated boundaries. One officer approached James specifically, his body language making it clear that the performance was over and consequences were about to begin. James tried to laugh it off, telling the officers he was just having fun and didn't mean any harm, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence, and his face had begun to flush red as he realized he had made a serious miscalculation. What he had intended as harmless entertainment was being treated as a security incident, and the crowd's mood toward him had turned decidedly hostile. Daniel remained at his post, his face still expressionless, but inside he was processing the entire sequence of events. He had been trained to handle many threats, but the challenge of being publicly humiliated while the security office at Buckingham Palace was nothing like the tourist-friendly areas James had visited earlier that morning. The stark white walls, security monitors, and serious-faced officers created an atmosphere that made his earlier confidence evaporate completely. He sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair while two security officers reviewed footage of his behavior on multiple screens, their expressions growing increasingly stern. As they watched his performance from various camera angles, James tried to explain that he had just been joking around, that tourists did this kind of thing all the time, and that he hadn't meant any real disrespect. His words sounded hollow even to his own ears as he watched himself on the monitors, seeing for the first time how his actions had looked from outside his own self-absorbed perspective. The mockery that had seemed funny and harmless in the moment now appeared cruel and deliberately humiliating. Senior Security Officer Margaret Thompson, a former military police officer with 20 years of experience, sat across from James with a file folder open in front of her. She had dealt with countless incidents involving disrespectful tourists, but something about this case had caught her particular attention. The involvement of the child, the presence of the veterans, and the sustained nature of James's mockery had elevated this from a simple warning situation to something more serious. Officer Thompson began explaining the regulations surrounding the Queen's Guards and the security protocols in place to protect both the guards and the public. She described the extensive training these soldiers underwent, their combat experience, and the significance of their ceremonial duties. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he began to understand that he hadn't just bothered a ceremonial figure, but had publicly humiliated a combat veteran who had served his country with distinction. The officer pulled out additional footage showing other tourists who had crossed similar lines in the past, explaining the consequences they had faced. Some had been banned from royal properties, others had faced legal charges for interfering with official duties, and several had become subjects of viral videos that damaged their personal and professional reputations. James felt his stomach drop as he realized the potential scope of consequences he was facing. Sarah had been waiting in a separate area, and when she was finally allowed to join James, her face was tight with anger and embarrassment. She had spent the past hours scrolling through social media and discovering that multiple videos of James's behavior had already been posted online. Comments ranged from mildly critical to outright hostile, with many viewers expressing disgust at his disrespectful treatment of a soldier who couldn't defend himself. One video in particular had begun gaining significant traction. It showed the moment when the young boy had intervened, contrasting the child's moral clarity with James's continued mockery. The caption read, "7-year-old shows more maturity than grown man mocking soldier," and had already been shared thousands of times. Sarah showed James the video, her voice shaking with frustration as she explained how his actions were now associated with her as well. Officer Thompson allowed them to review the social media posts, knowing that understanding the public response would be more effective than any lecture she could deliver. James watched video after video, reading comment after comment, and slowly began to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. People weren't just criticizing his behavior, they were questioning his character, his values, and his basic decency as a human being. The situation took another turn when Officer Thompson received a phone call that made her expression shift from stern to thoughtful. She excused herself from the room, leaving James and Sarah alone with their thoughts and the damning evidence playing on loop on the monitors. James put his head in his hands, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of shame and regret that he had been pushing away since being escorted from the courtyard. Sarah broke the tense silence by asking James what he had been thinking. What had possessed him to behave so disrespectfully towards someone who was simply doing his job? James struggled to articulate an answer that didn't sound pathetic. He admitted that he had gotten caught up in the moment, had wanted to entertain his friends and create memorable content for social media, and hadn't stopped to consider the actual human being beneath the uniform. Officer Thompson returned with unexpected news. The guard who had been the target of James's mockery had completed his shift and had made an unusual request. Guard Daniel Morrison had asked to speak with James directly, a request that was almost never granted but that senior palace officials had decided to allow, given the unique circumstances of the incident and the ongoing public attention it was receiving. James felt a mixture of relief and terror at this news. Part of him wanted the opportunity to apologize directly to the man he had wronged, but another part dreaded facing the guard outside the protective barrier of ceremonial protocol. He would now have to look Daniel Morrison in the eye and account for his actions. Not to a silent statue, but to a real person who had every right to be angry and offended. 20 minutes later, James and Sarah were led to a small meeting room where Guard Morrison sat waiting in casual military dress, his ceremonial uniform replaced by standard fatigues. Without the bearskin hat and red tunic, Daniel looked younger and somehow more intimidating, his military bearing evident in his posture and the direct way he met James's eyes when they entered the room. The contrast between this moment and their earlier interaction was stark. In the courtyard, Daniel had been bound by duty to remain silent and still while James performed for the crowd. Now, in this private setting, the power dynamic had completely reversed. James was the one who had to stand and account for his behavior while Daniel held the position of authority and dignity. Officer Thompson facilitated the meeting, explaining that this conversation was being recorded and could be used in determining what consequences James would face. She emphasized that Daniel had voluntarily agreed to this meeting despite having every right to simply let the security and legal processes run their course. This act of grace on Daniel's part made James feel even worse about his earlier behavior. Daniel spoke first, his voice calm but firm as he described what it felt like to stand at attention while being mocked and humiliated by someone who saw him as nothing more than a tourist attraction. He explained that the guards were highly trained soldiers who had chosen to take on ceremonial duties in addition to their combat roles, and that the discipline required to remain still and silent while being disrespected was actually more challenging than many aspects of military combat. James listened with growing discomfort as Daniel described his military service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan where he had seen friends injured and killed, while defending the freedoms that allowed tourists like James to visit London and behave however they pleased. Daniel wasn't trying to make James feel guilty through emotional manipulation. He was simply stating facts about the sacrifice and commitment that lay behind the ceremonial uniform James had treated as a joke. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Marcus shared the Officer Thompson interjected to explain the potential consequences James was facing. At minimum, he would be banned from all royal properties for a significant period. Depending on how the incident was classified and whether Daniel chose to pursue formal complaints, there could be additional legal and financial penalties. The viral nature of the videos also meant that James's employer and professional network would likely become aware of his behavior. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but not cruel. He explained that he wasn't interested in revenge or seeing James punished excessively. What he wanted was for James to genuinely understand the impact of his actions and to use his experience to help prevent similar incidents in the future. Too many tourists treated the guards with disrespect, and the problem was getting worse as social media encouraged people to create increasingly outrageous content for attention. James asked what he could do to make amends, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel exchanged a glance with Officer Thompson before responding. There might be an alternative to the standard punishments, he explained, but it would require James to commit significant time and effort to a program designed to educate people about military service and the importance of respect for those who serve. The program would involve working with veterans organizations, learning about the history and significance of ceremonial guard duties, and eventually creating educational content that could help other tourists understand appropriate behavior. It wouldn't erase what James had done, but it might transform his very public mistake into something that could benefit others and prevent future incidents. James agreed immediately, desperate for any opportunity to make things right. But Daniel held up a hand, cautioning him not to commit too quickly. This wasn't going to be a simple apology video or a few hours of community service. It would require months of genuine engagement, uncomfortable conversations, and honest self-examination. If James was only doing it to avoid punishment rather than because he genuinely wanted to change, it would be obvious and would ultimately make things worse. Sarah reached over and took James's hand, squeezing it gently. She told Daniel that she would hold James accountable throughout the process, that she wouldn't let him treat this as just another task to check off his list. Her support meant everything to James in that moment, a sign that their relationship might survive this incident if he truly committed to growth and change. Officer Thompson outlined the next steps. James would be formally banned from royal properties pending completion of the alternative program. He would meet with representatives from veterans organizations to design a personalized curriculum, addressing his specific attitudes and behaviors. His progress would be monitored closely, and any indication that he wasn't taking the commitment seriously would result in the full legal consequences being imposed immediately. As the meeting concluded, Daniel stood and extended his hand to James. The handshake was firm but not aggressive, a gesture of conditional trust that James knew he would have to work hard to deserve. Daniel's final words stayed with James as he left the palace grounds. Respect isn't something you're entitled to give or withhold based on someone's ability to respond. It's something every human being deserves, simply because of their humanity. The weight of potential consequences settled heavily on James's shoulders as he sat in the small meeting room, facing the guard he had so carelessly mocked just hours earlier. His phone, which had been returned to him temporarily, kept buzzing with notifications. His friends were texting frantically, his boss had left 3 voicemails, and his social media accounts were being flooded with angry messages from strangers who had seen the videos of his behavior. Daniel Morrison watched James's discomfort with a measured expression. He had agreed to this meeting not because he wanted revenge or to see James suffer, but because he believed that real accountability required human connection. It was easy to mock a silent figure in a ceremonial uniform. It was much harder to maintain that cruelty when forced to acknowledge the humanity of the person you had wronged. James finally found the courage to offer a direct apology, his voice breaking slightly as he tried to articulate how ashamed he felt about his actions. He acknowledged that no explanation could justify his behavior, and that he had allowed his desire for social media attention and peer approval to override his basic decency and respect for others. The apology was clumsy and inadequate, but it was genuine in a way that his earlier dismissive explanations had not been. Daniel accepted the apology with a slight nod, but made it clear that words alone could not undo the harm that had been done. The incident had been witnessed by thousands of tourists, including children who had learned from James's example that it was acceptable to mock and disrespect people who couldn't fight back. The videos circulating online would continue spreading that message far beyond the palace courtyard, potentially encouraging others to engage in similar behavior. Officer Thompson suggested a possible path forward that would address both the need for consequences and the opportunity for genuine restitution. If James was willing to take meaningful action to understand and repair the harm he had caused, the severity of his formal punishments might be reduced. This would not be a simple apology video or social media post. It would require substantial commitment and genuine transformation. The proposal involved several components. First, James would need to spend time learning about the history and significance of the Queen's Guard, understanding the military service and sacrifice that the ceremonial duties represented. Second, he would need to engage in community service work that supported veterans and active military personnel, putting himself in positions where he would have to serve rather than be served. Finally, he would need to create educational content that helped other tourists understand appropriate behavior and the importance of respecting the guards. James agreed immediately, desperate for any opportunity to make amends and reduce the consequences of his actions. But Daniel interjected with a cautionary note. This path would not be easy or quick, and it would require James to confront uncomfortable truths about his character and behavior. If he undertook this commitment only as a strategy to avoid punishment rather than genuine desire to change, it would be obvious and would ultimately make things worse. Sarah spoke up again, asking if she could participate in whatever program James would be undertaking. She acknowledged her own failure to intervene during his mockery and her general complicity in attitudes that treated service workers and ceremonial guards as less than fully human. Her request surprised both Officer Thompson and Daniel, who had expected her to distance herself from James and the incident. The conversation shifted to discussing what such a program might actually entail. Daniel explained that he knew several veterans organizations that worked with young people to teach respect, discipline, and understanding of military service. He offered to connect James with these programs, though he emphasized that his recommendation would be contingent on James demonstrating genuine commitment rather than just serving time to check a box. Officer Thompson outlined the formal consequences that would proceed regardless of James's participation in any voluntary restitution program. He was immediately banned from all royal properties for a minimum of 2 years. The incident would be documented in security databases that were shared with other significant tourist and government sites throughout the United Kingdom. His behavior had been serious enough to warrant official reporting, though formal criminal charges would be held in abeyance, pending his completion of the alternative program. James asked about the videos circulating online and whether anything could be done to remove them or limit their spread. Officer Thompson explained that once content went viral, it was essentially impossible to contain. The videos would likely follow James for years, potentially affecting his career, relationships, and reputation indefinitely. This was perhaps the most severe consequence of all. and one that no alternative program could fully address. Daniel added that while the videos were damaging to James's reputation, they also served an important educational function. Many people were learning for the first time about the proper way to interact with ceremonial guards and the disrespect that these soldiers routinely endured. Some good could come from James's very public mistake if it led to broader conversations about respect, dignity, and appropriate tourist behavior. The meeting concluded with Officer Thompson providing James with contact information for the veterans organizations that Daniel had mentioned. Along with detailed instructions about the requirements he would need to meet, she emphasized that this was not a guaranteed path to redemption, but rather an opportunity to begin making amends. His sincerity and commitment would be constantly evaluated, and any indication that he was simply going through the motions would result in the full, legal consequences being imposed. As James and Sarah left the palace grounds under escort, they walked past the spot where the incident had occurred just hours earlier. A different guard now stood at the post, equally still and professional, while tourists took respectful photographs from appropriate distances. The scene looked peaceful and orderly, giving no indication of the chaos that had unfolded there earlier in the day. James noticed the young boy who had intervened during his mockery, now holding his mother's hand and pointing excitedly at various features of the palace architecture. The child's innocent bravery had been the turning point in the entire incident, the moment when James's performance had been reframed from entertainment to bullying. James felt a sudden urge to thank the boy, but Officer Thompson had made it clear that he was to leave the palace grounds immediately and have no further interaction with witnesses or other tourists. The taxi ride back to their hotel was silent and tense. James's friends had sent messages saying they had decided to continue the vacation without him, not wanting to be associated with the viral videos or the potential consequences. Sarah stared out the window, clearly processing her own feelings about the incident and her relationship with someone who had proven capable of such casual cruelty. Back at the hotel, James finally allowed himself to fully confront what had happened. He opened his laptop and searched for the videos of his behavior, forcing himself to watch them from beginning to end. Seeing himself through the eyes of thousands of strangers was a brutal experience. The smug confidence, the complete lack of empathy, the way he had fed off the crowd's attention without any consideration for the human being he was humiliating. It was all captured in high definition from multiple angles. The comments on the videos were even harder to read. Many people questioned what kind of person would behave this way. What kind of upbringing or values would produce such casual disrespect for a soldier who had served his country? Some comments tried to find and expose information about James's employer, his hometown, his family, engaging in the same kind of public shaming that he had inflicted on Guard Morrison. James realized that he was now experiencing a small fraction of what Daniel had endured during the incident. The public judgment, the helplessness of having your image and reputation defined by the worst moments of your behavior, the knowledge that thousands of people were forming conclusions about your character based on limited information. The difference was that Daniel had been a blameless victim while James had brought this situation entirely upon himself. Sarah broke the silence by asking James what he planned to do next. Would he actually follow through on the alternative program Officer Thompson had outlined? Or would he simply try to wait out the negative attention and hope that public interest would eventually fade? Her question carried an unspoken ultimatum. His answer would determine whether their relationship continued. James looked at his girlfriend and saw the disappointment and uncertainty in her eyes. He thought about the guard who had stood silently enduring mockery, about the child who had shown more moral courage than any of the adults present, about the veterans who had watched with disgust as he disrespected one of their own. He thought about the man he had believed himself to be versus the man his actions had revealed him to actually be. For the first time in his adult life, James felt truly humbled. His expensive education, successful career, and confident social persona had all proven worthless in this moment of moral testing. A 7-year-old child and a 26-year-old soldier had both demonstrated more character and integrity than he had, shown in his entire performance that morning. James reached for Sarah's hand and told her with complete sincerity that he was committed to the program, not because he wanted to avoid punishment, but because he desperately needed to become a better person. He acknowledged that he didn't fully understand yet what that transformation would require, but he was finally ready to do the uncomfortable work of examining his values, confronting his privilege, and learning genuine respect for people whose experiences were different from his own. Sarah squeezed his hand, her expression softening slightly. She told him that she would support him through this process, but that support meant holding him accountable when he wanted to quit or revert to his old attitudes. It meant being honest about his progress and not letting him perform growth without actually changing. James nodded, understanding that this was exactly the kind of accountability he needed. 3 days after the incident at Buckingham Palace, James sat in a small community center in East London, surrounded by 15 military veterans who ranged in age from their mid-20s to late 70s. This was his first session with the Veterans Respect and Education Program, an organization that Daniel Morrison had recommended as part of his alternative restitution path. The atmosphere was formal but not hostile, though James could feel the weight of skeptical eyes assessing whether he was genuinely committed to change or simply trying to avoid harsher consequences. The program director, RETIRED, Colonel Arthur Bennett, opened the session by explaining the purpose of the 8-week commitment James had agreed to undertake. The program wasn't designed to punish but to educate, helping people understand the reality of military service, the significance of ceremonial duties, and the psychological impact of public disrespect toward those who serve. Colonel Bennett made it clear that James was not the first person to go through this program after disrespecting a guard, but his viral notoriety made him perhaps the most publicly visible participant they had ever accepted. James was required to introduce himself and explain what had brought him to the program. Standing before these veterans, many of whom wore visible scars from their service, James felt his carefully prepared speech dissolved into raw honesty. He described his behavior at the palace without trying to minimize or excuse it, acknowledging that he had treated Guard Morrison as a prop for entertainment rather than recognizing him as a fellow human being who deserved respect and dignity. The veterans listened in silence as James spoke, their expressions ranging from stern disapproval to something that might have been recognition. Several of them had experienced similar disrespect during their own service, whether in ceremonial roles or simply in public while wearing their uniforms. They understood both the unique vulnerability of being unable to respond and the deeper frustration of having your service and sacrifice reduced to a tourist attraction. After James finished speaking, the veterans began sharing their own stories. A former Royal Marine described standing guard at a war memorial while teenagers threw food at him and made jokes about his stillness. A retired Army officer talked about the harassment female soldiers faced during ceremonial duties, including inappropriate touching and sexual comments from tourists who felt emboldened by the soldiers' inability to respond. An elderly Korean War veteran spoke about the long-term psychological impact of feeling dehumanized and disrespected after giving years of his life to military service. These stories had a profound effect on James. He had somehow imagined that his incident was unique, a one-time lapse in judgment that didn't reflect broader patterns of behavior. But listening to these veterans, he began to understand that his actions were part of a much larger problem of how society treated military personnel, particularly those in ceremonial or public-facing roles. His behavior had been individual, but it reflected and reinforced cultural attitudes that devalued service and sacrifice. The session included an educational component, where Colonel Bennett walked the group through the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. James learned that these weren't just ceremonial positions, but were filled by active-duty soldiers from elite regiments with distinguished combat histories. The guards at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and the Tower of London were the same soldiers who had fought in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones around the world. Their ceremonial duties were considered an honor and a trust, not a demotion or an easy assignment. Colonel Bennett explained the rigorous selection process for guard duty, the extensive training in both military protocol and crowd management, and the physical and mental discipline required to maintain composure during long shifts in all-weather conditions while being constantly photographed and occasionally harassed by tourists. The guards were trained to respond to genuine security threats with swift and decisive action, but also to ignore provocations and disrespect that didn't pose actual danger. This last point particularly resonated with James. He had assumed that Daniel Morrison's silence and stillness during the mockery meant he wasn't bothered or affected by the behavior. But the veterans explained that remaining professional in the face of disrespect often required more strength than responding aggressively. The discipline to maintain composure when you desperately wanted to defend yourself or confront someone who was crossing boundaries was a skill that took years to develop. The program required James to volunteer at a Veterans Support Center 3 days a week, performing basic tasks like organizing donations, helping with administrative work, and assisting with events. This aspect of his restitution was designed to put him in a position of service, rather than the position of privilege he was accustomed to occupying. It would also expose him to veterans dealing with challenges like homelessness, unemployment, mental health issues, and physical disabilities resulting from their military service. James's first day at the support center was humbling in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself taking instructions from people he might have previously ignored or looked down upon: homeless veterans, young soldiers struggling with PTSD, older service members whose physical injuries made simple tasks difficult. The role reversal forced him to confront his own prejudices and assumptions about worth, success, and what deserved respect. One veteran in particular, a 40-year-old former sergeant named Michael Green, who was dealing with homelessness and traumatic brain injury, became an unexpected teacher for James. Michael had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before a roadside bomb left him with cognitive difficulties that made it hard to maintain employment. Despite his challenges, Michael maintained a dignity and sense of humor that James found both inspiring and humbling. Michael had seen the viral videos of James's behavior at the palace and recognized him immediately when he started volunteering at the center. Rather than expressing anger or judgment, Michael simply asked James if he understood yet why his actions had been so hurtful. The question led to a conversation that continued over multiple volunteer shifts, with Michael patiently explaining the psychological impact of being treated as less than human by people who had never sacrificed anything significant for others. Sarah had decided to accompany James to his volunteer shifts, honoring her commitment to participate in his restitution program. Her presence was both supportive and challenging, as she held him accountable when he showed signs of reverting to his old attitudes, or treating the program as a box-checking exercise rather than genuine growth opportunity. Their relationship had become strained since the incident, but working together toward meaningful change was slowly rebuilding the foundation of trust and respect. The veterans at the center began to accept James's presence as he demonstrated consistent effort and genuine interest in learning from them. He listened to their stories without trying to center his own experience or compare his comfortable life to their struggles. He performed even mundane tasks with attention and care, recognizing that these small acts of service mattered in the daily operation of a center that provided crucial support to vulnerable veterans. Back in New York, James's professional life had become complicated by the viral videos. His employer, a prestigious investment firm, had called him in for a meeting about the incident and its potential impact on the company's reputation. While they hadn't fired him, they had made it clear that any further incidents would result in immediate termination. Several clients had specifically requested not to work with him, and his path to partnership at the firm had been significantly delayed if not entirely derailed. These professional consequences were difficult to accept, but James was beginning to understand that they were entirely appropriate given his behavior. He had displayed a fundamental lack of judgment and character that legitimately raised questions about his fitness for positions of responsibility and trust. The fact that his mockery of Guard Morrison had been captured on video and widely shared didn't make the consequences unfair. It simply made his character flaws more visible to others than they usually were. James's family had also seen the videos, leading to painful conversations about values and behavior that they had thought they had instilled in him. His mother, in particular, was horrified by his actions and struggled to reconcile the son she thought she knew with the man she had seen mocking a soldier on camera. These conversations forced James to examine how he had strayed so far from the values he had been raised with, how success and privilege had gradually eroded his empathy and basic respect for others. The weekly sessions with the veterans continued to provide both education and accountability. James learned about the specific challenges faced by the Queen's Guard, including tourists who tried to make them laugh, touched them or their uniforms without permission, insulted them based on race or appearance, or attempted to interfere with their duties for social media content. He heard stories of guards who had been injured when tourists crossed boundaries, and others who had suffered lasting psychological effects from sustained harassment during their ceremonial duties. Colonel Bennett emphasized that James's incident, while serious, was far from the worst behavior guards had endured. Some tourists had been physically aggressive, others had engaged in sexual harassment, and still others had used racial or ethnic slurs. The ceremonial nature of the guards' duties and their requirement to remain largely unresponsive created a unique vulnerability that some visitors exploited for entertainment or to assert power over someone who couldn't fight. Understanding the broader context of disrespectful tourist behavior didn't excuse James's actions, but it did help him see how his individual choices fit into larger patterns that needed to change. He began to think about how his experience might be used to educate other tourists and prevent similar incidents, transforming his very public mistake into something that could actually benefit the guards. He had helped disrespect through his behavior and example. During his 4th week in the program, James had a breakthrough moment while organizing donated clothing at the Veterans Center. Michael Green was sorting through boxers nearby, humming quietly to himself despite the obvious challenges his injuries created for even simple tasks. James paused in his work and asked Michael how he maintained such positive attitude given everything he had been through and continued to face. Michael stopped what he was doing and looked at James with genuine kindness. He explained that perspective came from understanding what truly mattered in life. He had seen friends die in combat, had lost his career and his home to injuries sustained while serving his country, but he still had his life and the opportunity to help other veterans who were struggling. The respect or disrespect of strangers couldn't diminish what he had accomplished or the bonds he had formed with fellow service members. This conversation stayed with James long after that volunteer shift ended. Michael had more reason than almost anyone to be bitter, angry, and disrespectful toward a society that hadn't adequately supported him after his service. Yet he chose dignity, humor, and service to others. The contrast with James's own behavior, mocking a soldier for entertainment, despite having every advantage in life, was stark and humbling. 6 weeks into his restitution program, James received an unexpected email from guard Daniel Morrison. The message was brief but significant, requesting a follow-up meeting to discuss James's progress and a potential project that could help address the broader issues of tourist disrespect toward ceremonial guards. The email was formal but not cold, suggesting that Daniel had been monitoring James's commitment to the program and had seen something worth engaging with further. The meeting took place at the same Veterans Center where James had been volunteering, creating a very different atmosphere from their first encounter in the palace security office. This time, they met as two people working toward a common goal, rather than as victim and perpetrator. Daniel arrived in civilian clothes, looking relaxed but purposeful as he shook hands with James and Sarah, who had insisted on attending to show her continued support. Daniel began by acknowledging the reports he had received from Colonel Bennett and the center staff about James's genuine engagement with the program. Unlike many participants who simply went through the motions to avoid harsher consequences, James had demonstrated real curiosity about military service, asked thoughtful questions, and showed respect toward the veterans he worked alongside. Daniel had also noticed that James hadn't posted anything on social media trying to rehabilitate his image or gain sympathy, choosing instead to focus on the actual work of learning and growing. James listened to this feedback with a mixture of relief and continued shame. He explained that he had initially approached the program with the mindset of simply completing requirements and moving past the incident, but the veterans' stories, particularly Michael Green's patient explanations of how dehumanization affected people who had sacrificed for their country, had fundamentally changed his perspective. He no longer saw the program as punishment he needed to endure, but as education he desperately needed to receive. Daniel then outlined his proposal, which was both ambitious and potentially uncomfortable for James. The palace security team and several veterans organizations had been discussing ways to reduce disrespectful tourist behavior toward the guards. They believed that educational content created by someone who had personally experienced transformation from perpetrator to advocate might be more effective than traditional warnings or regulations. Daniel was proposing that James create a documentary-style video series about his journey, including his original mockery, the consequences he faced, and what he had learned through the restitution program. The proposal made James's stomach turn. The viral videos of his behavior had been bad enough, but at least those hadn't included his own narration and reflection. Creating content that deliberately showcased his worst moment, while explaining his thought process, felt like volunteering for public humiliation on an even larger scale. But as Daniel explained the potential impact, James began to understand why this uncomfortable approach might be necessary. Daniel pointed out that millions of tourists visited London each year, and many of them saw the guards as attractions rather than soldiers. Traditional educational materials about respectful behavior were ignored or dismissed because tourists didn't connect them to real consequences or human impact. But a story showing actual transformation, with James as a cautionary tale who had learned from his mistakes, might reach people in ways that rules and regulations never could. Sarah immediately supported the idea, recognizing that it would transform James's viral shame into something potentially useful for others. She offered to help with the production, using her background in marketing to ensure the content was engaging and shareable. Colonel Bennett, who had been invited to join the latter part of the meeting, also endorsed the proposal, noting that the veterans organizations would provide oversight to ensure the content was respectful and accurate. James asked for time to consider the proposal, struggling with the vulnerability and continued public exposure it would require. Daniel respected his hesitation but encouraged him to think about the guards, who would continue facing disrespect if nothing changed. Every tourist who saw James's transformation story and chose to behave respectfully as a result would represent one less incident that a soldier would have to silently endure. That evening, James and Sarah had a long conversation about the proposal and what it would mean for their future. Creating this content would permanently link James to his worst moment, making it impossible to ever fully move past the incident or control how it was remembered. But refusing the proposal meant missing an opportunity to transform his mistake into something meaningful, to prevent other people from inflicting the same harm he had caused, Sarah pointed out. Something James hadn't fully considered. His privilege gave him options that most people didn't have when they made public mistakes. He could choose to participate in this project or decline, return to his life in New York, and eventually rebuild his reputation through time and professional success. But Guard Morrison and countless other ceremonial soldiers didn't have the option to decline being treated as tourist attractions, to avoid harassment, or to respond when disrespected. Using his privilege to help protect them from future incidents seemed like the least he could do. James spent the next 2 days watching and rewatching the viral videos of his behavior, trying to articulate what had been going through his mind during those moments. he realized that he had never actually stopped to consider Daniel Morrison as a real person with thoughts, feelings, and a history of service and sacrifice. The guard had been reduced in James's mind to a living prop, something that existed for his entertainment rather than someone who deserved basic human dignity. This realization led James to agree to Daniel's proposal, with one condition: the content had to be completely honest about his thought process, motivations, and the ongoing nature of his transformation. It couldn't be a neat redemption story where he learned his lesson and became a better person overnight. It had to show the messy, uncomfortable reality of confronting your own prejudices and entitlement, of slowly learning to see people you had previously dismissed or dehumanized. The production process began 2 weeks later, with James sitting in front of a camera at the Veterans Center, surrounded by the people who had taught him so much over the past 2 months. The first video in the series started with the viral footage of his mockery, which was still difficult for him to watch but necessary to establish the context. Then James spoke directly to the camera, explaining without excuses what he had been thinking and feeling during those moments at the palace. He described the mindset of seeing the guard as entertainment rather than as a person, the way social media had trained him to view experiences as content opportunities rather than real moments with real people. He talked about privilege and entitlement, about how his comfortable life had insulated him from ever having to think seriously about sacrifice or service. The honesty was raw and uncomfortable, but it was exactly what Daniel and Colonel Bennett believed would resonate with other tourists who might be tempted to engage in similar behavior. The second video focused on the immediate aftermath and consequences, including his meeting with Daniel, the shock of seeing himself through others' eyes, and the realization that his actions had been captured and shared around the world. James didn't minimize the embarrassment or the professional and personal costs he had faced, but he emphasized that those consequences were entirely appropriate and far less severe than what he deserved. Subsequent videos documented his work with the Veterans Program, featuring interviews with Colonel Bennett, Michael Green, and other service members who shared their experiences with disrespectful tourist behavior. These segments provided context and education, helping viewers understand the military backgrounds of ceremonial guards, the discipline required for their duties, and the psychological impact of being treated as objects rather than people. The most powerful segment featured Daniel Morrison returning to his guard post at Buckingham Palace, with James watching from the crowd as tourists interacted with him. The footage showed both respectful visitors, who took photos from appropriate distances, and others, who began testing boundaries in ways that could escalate into incidents similar to James's original behavior. James's voiceover explained what he now understood about each interaction: the difference between appreciation and exploitation, between interest and disrespect. Throughout the production process, James continued his volunteer work at the Veterans Center and his weekly sessions with the program. The dual commitment was exhausting, but it kept him grounded in the reality of military service and sacrifice rather than getting lost in the abstract concepts of the video project. Michael Green became his informal advisor, reviewing rough cuts of the videos and providing feedback about whether they accurately represented veterans' experiences and perspectives. The final video in the series addressed the question of redemption and whether James believed he had earned forgiveness for his actions. His answer was carefully considered and honest. He didn't believe redemption was something he could earn or claim, but rather something that others might choose to grant him based on his continued actions over time. He had no right to demand that Daniel or any other veteran forgive him, just as he had no right to declare himself transformed and redeemed. Instead, James committed to ongoing growth and service, recognizing that his incident at the palace had revealed character flaws and attitudes that required constant attention and correction. He would continue working with veterans organizations, advocating for respectful treatment of ceremonial guards, and using his platform to educate others about the human cost of treating soldiers as tourist attractions. Before releasing the video series, James showed the complete content to Daniel for his approval. They sat together in a small conference room at the palace, watching hours of footage that documented James's transformation from arrogant tourist to humble advocate. Daniel watched in silence, his expression unreadable, while James anxiously waited for his response. When the videos ended, Daniel was quiet for several minutes before speaking. He acknowledged that the content was honest and educational, that it didn't excuse James's behavior but rather used it as a teaching moment that might prevent future incidents. He appreciated that James hadn't tried to make himself the hero of a redemption story, but rather positioned himself as someone still learning and growing. However, Daniel also cautioned that releasing these videos would open James up to renewed criticism and judgment. The internet had largely moved on from the original incident, but this new content would bring everything back into public consciousness. People who had forgotten about the mockery would be reminded of it, and new audiences would discover it for the first time. James needed to be prepared for that renewed scrutiny and potential backlash. James acknowledged these risks, but explained that preventing even one tourist from disrespecting a guard made the personal cost worthwhile. He had caused harm through his thoughtless actions, Using his platform to prevent similar harm seemed like the minimum he could do. Sarah, who was present for the screening, added that they had discussed the risks extensively and were prepared to face whatever consequences came from telling this story honestly. Daniel gave his approval for the video series to be released, with one request, that a portion of any revenue generated from the content be directed to veterans support organizations. James agreed immediately, explaining that he had never intended to profit from his mistakes. Any money earned would go directly to the people and programs that had taught him so much about service, sacrifice, and human dignity. The video series launched on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after the original incident at Buckingham Palace. James sat in his apartment in New York, watching the view counterclimb as thousands of people discovered his story. Sarah was beside him, her hand in his, both of them knowing that this moment would define how his mistake was ultimately remembered, and whether his transformation would be seen as genuine or merely performative. The initial response was mixed and intense. Some viewers praised James's honesty and willingness to be vulnerable about his character flaws. They appreciated the educational content about the Queen's Guard and the respectful treatment that ceremonial soldiers deserved. Many commented that they had never fully considered the humanity of the guards before, that they too had thought of them primarily as tourist attractions rather than as real people with military backgrounds and personal lives. However, other viewers remained skeptical or outright hostile. They questioned whether James's transformation was genuine or simply a calculated public relations strategy to rehabilitate his reputation. Some argued that no amount of volunteer work or educational content could erase the disrespect he had shown toward a soldier who couldn't defend himself. Others suggested that giving James a platform to tell his story was itself a form of privilege, that someone with fewer resources and connections would never have received such an opportunity for redemption. James read these comments carefully, understanding that both the praise and the criticism contained important truths. He responded to neither the supportive nor the hostile comments. Having learned from Colonel Bennett that his actions needed to speak louder than his words, the video series existed as his statement and his commitment. Defending it or arguing with critics would only undermine its message about accountability and growth. The media picked up on the story within days, with several news outlets running features about the tourist who had mocked a guard and then spent months working to understand and repair the harm he had caused. These articles brought renewed attention to the original incident, exactly as Daniel had warned, but they also sparked broader conversations about tourist behavior, military service, and the nature of genuine accountability. Palace officials released a statement, acknowledging the video series and expressing hope that it would encourage more respectful behavior from visitors to royal properties. They noted that incidents of tourist disrespect toward guards had been increasing in recent years, driven partly by social media culture that encouraged outrageous behavior for viral content. If James's story could help reverse that trend, it would represent a meaningful contribution to protecting the dignity and safety of ceremonial soldiers. The veterans organizations that had worked with James also released statements supporting the video series and his ongoing commitment to their programs. Colonel Bennett was interviewed by several news outlets, explaining the philosophy behind the restitution program and how James's participation had been more thorough and genuine than most. Michael Green appeared in one interview, speaking movingly about how working with James had reminded him that people were capable of real growth when properly challenged and supported. Perhaps most significantly, the video series began to have measurable impact on tourist behavior at Buckingham Palace and other sites with ceremonial guards. Security personnel reported fewer incidents of disrespect in the weeks following the release, and several tourists mentioned having watched James's videos before their visits. The content was being shared by schools, military organizations, and travel companies as educational material for people planning trips to London. James received hundreds of messages from people around the world who said the videos had changed their perspective on military service and ceremonial duties. Some were veterans who appreciated seeing the guards' experiences validated and explained to civilian audiences. Others were people who admitted they might have engaged in similar disrespectful behavior without understanding the impact. A few were guards themselves, thanking James for using his platform to address a problem they faced regularly but couldn't speak about publicly. One message in particular affected James deeply. It came from the mother of the 7-year-old boy who had intervened during the original incident. She explained that her son had been confused and upset by James's behavior toward the guard, unable to understand why an adult would be mean to someone who couldn't respond. Watching the video series together had provided an opportunity to discuss difficult topics like accountability, growth, and the importance of standing up for others even when it was uncomfortable or scary. The mother thanked James for modeling genuine accountability rather than simply disappearing or making excuses. She explained that her son needed to see that adults could make serious mistakes and then do the hard work of making amends. The message included a drawing the boy had made, showing James and Guard Morrison shaking hands, with the caption, "Friends, after sorry," written in careful, childish letters. James framed that drawing and hung it in his apartment, a reminder of the innocent moral clarity that had ultimately triggered his transformation. The child's intervention had been the turning point, the moment when his mockery had been reframed as the bullying it truly was. That a 7-year-old had shown more courage and character than any of the adults present remained a humbling truth that James carried with him. His relationship with Sarah had strengthened through the process of creating and releasing the video series. Working together toward a meaningful goal had rebuilt the trust and respect that his original behavior had damaged. She had seen him at his worst and then watched him do the difficult work of becoming better. Their relationship was now built on a more honest foundation, one that acknowledged human flaws while still believing in the possibility of growth and change. Professionally, the video series had complicated effects on James's career. Some clients and colleagues respected his willingness to be vulnerable and accountable, seeing leadership potential in someone who could admit mistakes and work to repair harm. Others remained uncomfortable with his viral notoriety, preferring to distance themselves from someone whose worst moment was permanently documented online. James accepted both responses as natural consequences of his actions, focusing on demonstrating competence and integrity in his current work rather than trying to control others' perceptions. 3 months after the video series launched, James received an invitation to speak at a conference on military-civilian relations and the treatment of service members in public spaces. The invitation came from an organization that worked to bridge understanding between military and civilian communities, helping each group appreciate the other's perspectives and experiences. They wanted James to present his story as a case study in accountability, transformation, and the power of education to change attitudes and behaviors. James accepted the invitation with some trepidation, knowing that speaking to an audience of military personnel and veterans advocates would be challenging and potentially uncomfortable. But Daniel encouraged him to participate, noting that sharing his story in person would have different impact than the video series alone. Seeing someone speak honestly about their mistakes and growth, answering questions in real time rather than through edited content, created a different kind of connection and credibility. The conference took place in Manchester, bringing together military personnel, veterans, civilian advocates, and policymakers who worked on issues affecting service members and their families. James's presentation was scheduled for the second day, giving him time to attend other sessions and hear from people whose work focused on supporting military communities and addressing challenges they faced. One panel discussion particularly resonated with James. It featured guards from various ceremonial units discussing their experiences with tourist behavior and the psychological toll of being treated as objects rather than people. They described the strange experience of standing perfectly still while strangers posed beside them, touched their uniforms, made jokes at their expense, or tried deliberately to make them break composure. The guards spoke with professionalism and restraint, but their underlying frustration and hurt were evident. When James's turn came to present, he walked onto the stage feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes, many belonging to people who had every reason to judge him harshly for his behavior. He began by showing clips from the original viral videos, forcing the audience to witness his mockery of Guard Morrison. The room was silent as they watched, the discomfort palpable. Then James spoke about what had been going through his mind during those moments, the thoughtlessness and entitlement that had allowed him to treat another human being so disrespectfully. He didn't excuse or minimize his actions, but rather used them as a starting point for discussing broader cultural attitudes toward military service and ceremonial duties. He acknowledged his privilege in receiving opportunities for redemption that others might not have gotten, and his ongoing responsibility to use that privilege to benefit people who had been harmed by attitudes like those he had displayed. The question and answer session that followed was challenging and honest. Several veterans asked pointed questions about his motivations and whether his transformation was genuine or strategic. James answered each question directly, acknowledging when he didn't know something or when his perspective was still limited by his lack of military experience. He emphasized that he was still learning and growing. That transformation was an ongoing process rather than a destination he had already reached. One question came from a young woman who identified herself as a ceremonial guard at Windsor Castle. She asked James what he would say to tourists who felt their behavior was harmless fun, who didn't understand why guards couldn't just laugh along with jokes or ignore minor disrespect. James thought carefully before responding, explaining that what seemed like harmless fun to the tourist was actually a violation of boundaries and dignity for the guard, who had no choice but to endure it while maintaining professional composure. He compared it to other situations where people in service positions couldn't freely respond to poor treatment: retail workers dealing with rude customers, healthcare professionals facing patient abuse, teachers managing disrespectful students. In each case, the inability to respond freely didn't mean the behavior wasn't hurtful or inappropriate. It actually made it worse, because the target had to absorb the disrespect without defending themselves or setting boundaries. The guard who asked the question nodded thoughtfully, thanking James for his answer and for his work since the incident. She explained that many guards felt invisible in their roles, simultaneously hyper-visible as tourist attractions, while being completely unseen as real people with feelings and dignity. Having someone acknowledge that paradox and work to change, it meant more than James probably understood. As the conference concluded, several attendees approached James to continue conversations, share their own experiences, or simply express appreciation for his willingness to be vulnerable about his mistakes and growth. Daniel Morrison, who had attended the conference to support James's presentation, stood back watching these interactions with a slight smile. The man who had mocked him at the palace 3 months earlier had genuinely transformed, not into someone perfect or beyond criticism, but into someone committed to using his experience to prevent similar harm. That evening, James and Daniel had dinner together at a quiet restaurant away from the conference venue. They talked about the progress that had been made since the incident, the increased awareness about respectful treatment of guards, and the ongoing challenges that remained. Daniel shared that he had recently returned to his guard post after a rotation to other duties, and that he had noticed subtle changes in how tourists approached him. More visitors were maintaining appropriate distance, asking permission before taking photos, and showing genuine appreciation for his service rather than treating him as a prop. Daniel credited the video series and increased awareness for these changes, acknowledging that James's willingness to be publicly accountable had contributed to meaningful improvements in guard safety and dignity. James asked Daniel a question that had been on his mind since their first meeting. Why had he agreed to participate in James's restitution process instead of simply pursuing maximum consequences through formal channels? Daniel's answer was thoughtful and revealing. He explained that punishment alone rarely changed people's underlying attitudes and behaviors. James could have been banned, fined, or publicly condemned, but he might have simply become resentful rather than reflective. By engaging directly with James, offering him a path toward genuine understanding and growth, Daniel had taken a risk that the transformation might be real. And it had been. The man sitting across from him at dinner was fundamentally different from the arrogant tourist who had mocked him months earlier. That transformation had required James's willingness to do uncomfortable work, but it also required Daniel's willingness to see potential for growth rather than just someone deserving punishment. As they prepared to part ways, Daniel made one final request of James, that he continue his work with veterans organizations and advocacy for respectful treatment of ceremonial guards. Even as public interest in his story faded, the real measure of transformation wasn't the viral videos or the conference presentation, but the sustained commitment to service and growth over months and years. James promised that commitment, understanding that his accountability to Daniel and to the veterans who had taught him so much extended far beyond completing a formal program or achieving some defined endpoint. He had been changed by this experience in ways that required ongoing attention and action, not a single dramatic gesture of redemption. Flying back to New York the next day, James reflected on the journey that had begun with thoughtless mockery and led to genuine transformation. He had learned that respect wasn't something earned through rank or status, but something owed to every person by virtue of their humanity. He had discovered that privilege carried responsibilities, that having opportunities others didn't meant using them to benefit people who had been harmed by attitudes and behaviors like those he had displayed. Most importantly, James had learned that accountability wasn't about performing remorse or executing a perfect redemption arc, but about doing the sustained, uncomfortable work of examining your character, confronting your flaws, and choosing growth even when it required vulnerability and sacrifice. The viral videos of his worst moment would follow him forever, but so would the relationships he had built with veterans like Michael Green, the education he had received from people like Colonel Bennett, and the grace he had been shown by Daniel Morrison, the tourist who had mocked the Queen's Guard had become an advocate for the respect and dignity that all service members deserved. It wasn't the story James had imagined telling about himself, but it was the story his actions had written. And moving forward, he was committed to ensuring that story continued with ongoing service, sustained growth, and genuine accountability to the people who had believed he could become better than his worst moment.